uh, my most recent book project and how that has been transitioning and changing on account of the pandemic. So um, let me start present. Okay, so obviously, when we think about 2020, this is the first thing that comes to mind: the COVID-19 virus and the coronavirus pandemic that has been sweeping the globe. And if there's anything we can say, I mean, we can say a lot of things about the coronavirus, but obviously, it's affected our lives and our livelihoods first and foremost. It's unfortunately ended the lives of many people around the world, but it's decimated all kinds of plans, all kinds of daily habits and routine practices have all been upended. And one thing that the coronavirus has done is that it has changed how we think and talk about the future, particularly, I can say, in the United States, both just anecdotally as well as through journalistic discourse and whatnot. There was a lot of discussion about, the way that the coronavirus kind of stopped people from being able to plan, being able to think about the future, and made the future a really precarious endeavor. But very quickly, in my sort of research through the pandemic, conversations about the future started to emerge. And what I found interesting about these conversations about the future is that they were very much focused on what the coronavirus would portend coming forward. So starting with the coronavirus as a sort of assumption about life, and then thinking about how life might change going forward with that. So everything from work from home to education and family socializing pods, how it might affect travel or economies going forward, whether or not people would want to touch each other, and how hand sanitation might become part of our daily routines, how dating and going out would change if we had to do it with masks or plexiglass. And so all of these different kinds of things were elements of how coronavirus sort of became the prism through which people understood the future. Another thing that was happening, though, was that the coronavirus obviously didn't upend and change everything. It also sort of gave birth to its own culture and its own consumer culture. So even as we were worrying about whether or not we'd be able to see loved ones or family members who lived far away, even as we were questioning whether our jobs would be there, whether the health systems would be able to find a solution or a cure or a vaccine for this virus, people were also growing COVID mustaches and letting their hair go gray, learning how to bake bread and subsequently gaining weight because of baking that bread and eating it, having Zoom happy hours. So there was a whole culture that started to emerge, a consumer culture that started to emerge around the pandemic as well. And I think that this is indicative of two interesting things about thinking about the future. One is that we tend to emulate people's behavior, right? So despite the fact that we were socially isolated, we continued to look to others to try to figure out what to do. And there were even trends that were happening, even despite the fact that people were not consuming as much or consuming as publicly. But secondly, it goes back to what I was saying before, which is that notions about how the world will be are often very much rooted in the assumptions of the particular moment. So thinking about how people breaking bread might portend for restaurants or bakeries going out of business, right, is really making an assumption about now and extrapolating that outward, rather than actually saying necessarily saying something very instructive about the future itself. So what I'm interested in here is a couple of different things. And one of the things that did not change with the pandemic is the fact that habits and ways of doing and being continued to seem to move in tandem, despite the fact that people were socially isolated from one another. So I'm very interested in this dynamic in general, and have been interested in this dynamic in my work. And more to the point with this talk is I've been very interested in the industrial processes that help to coordinate these sort of movements in fashion and taste and behavior that seem to happen in tandem. And I think that this happens through many different facets, but there's a couple of things that I want to point out. So I have a picture of a tie-dyed sweatshirt here. My guess is that many of us have not been doing that much clothes shopping over the last year, but if you have done clothes shopping, you've probably bought something comfortable. It was probably a sweatshirt or a pair of sweatpants. And there is a good possibility that those things might have been tie-dye, or you might have seen tie-dye in the stores if you were looking online or you happened to go out. And that speaks to these industrial processes that exist in the fashion industry that determined that tie-dye was going to be the thing that was in fashion this year, despite the fact that the way that we shop was upended. So that's one layer in which we can think about these coordinated fashions and tastes and behaviors happening through industrial ways. But the other one that I want to talk about for the remainder of my time is the trend industry. And the trend industry is, I would say when I started working on my book in 2015, it was a very little known industry. I think it's known a little bit more now. And I want to just say a little bit about what the trend industry is and how I conceptualize it in my work. So I think of the trend industry as a multi-million-dollar industry working around the world that offers research, strategic advisement, and foresight for a variety of companies. It works as a sort of hybrid between management consulting, branding, and advertising. And there are many different kinds of trend forecasters. And there are also many different trend methods, and I'm not going to get into that today. But there are trend forecasters who work exclusively in fashion, who work exclusively in color, who work exclusively in technology. I could go on, but I've been most interested in cultural trend forecasters and how trend forecasters use sort of these cultural movements and these habits and these behaviors to think about both the near and the long-term future. So I won't talk much about this slide, but I do want to say that the deep-rooted assumption within the work of trend forecasting is the diffusion of innovation, which those of you who are communication scholars might be familiar with this Everett Rogers idea from the 60s, which was very deeply embedded and enmeshed into thinking about marketing across the 70s and the 80s in particular. And this is basically the idea that there are people who are ahead of other people. I can have a long conversation about what makes somebody ahead or behind, but the idea is that there's a certain small population of people whom others follow, and that if we sort of map cultural movement, we can move from those innovators or those influencers across the population through the early adopters to the early majority and the late majority and so forth. And this is a foundational assumption in both marketing as well as in futurism. So in my last minute here, I just want to say a little bit about what trend forecasting has looked like during the pandemic. And you might think, why would anybody imagine that you could even think about the future during the pandemic, or that you could forecast the future? There's a couple of different points about this. One, I saw a lot of companies who were very interested in seeking any form of certainty in the face of so much uncertainty. And so lots of these businesses were actually seeing more business rather than less. They were also recognizing that they were not future-proof, which is a little bit of annoying business lingo, but basically this idea that they realized that they were not ready for what was coming. And so they were just looking for somebody to give them some sense that things were going to be okay. And that was the role that a lot of these trend forecasters played. Despite that, one of the things that I saw is that the future, once the sort of dramatic and kind of far-flung ideas about the pandemic sort of started to subside, what you really saw was that the future meant next. And it stopped even meaning 18 months from now and started meaning like 18 weeks from now. So the time horizon of the future really shortened during the pandemic. And obviously this caused a lot of big questions. Some of the things that we've had conversations with, particularly in the States, about during the pandemic, like climate change, like addressing systemic racism, addressing sort of inequities through capitalism. A lot of those things went unresolved. And I'm happy to say more about that during the questions too. And I just want to close with this one last quote. This is from Nikki Savall from the New York Times in September. And he wrote, what we mean by the future, a utopian ideal throughout much of the 20th century, is now undeniably much darker as we progress further into the 21st. And I think this is a really important idea because future forecastings often sell optimism. And so when you're in a sort of situation in which optimism is kind of not the order of the day, how do you contend with that is a really interesting question to watch through trends at this particular moment. So I will stop there, and hopefully that was about 7 minutes. I don't know how I do.
Dan, Sophie?
I'll go next, sure.
Okay.
Yeah. It's the like dance of figuring out which window Zoom is going to tell you to open. I can't stand it. Is this the right one? This is the right one. Perfect. So you can share that's working in that I can see chat box. Cool. So thanks to the Digital Humanities Network and to the McLuhan Center for having us, and to Devon and Sophie for making time to come and join and think together. That's the best part of these. I study marketing and marketing consultancies, but what I'm really interested within the world of marketing in are smaller firms, smaller organizations, especially those that popped up in the 70s or in the 80s and might already be closed, and which are ran by members of the communities that they package, they promote, and they sell. So marketing firms whose principles come from the places that they are trying to construct an audience through. We tend to think of the 70s and 80s as this like programmatic turn in marketing and in advertising research, where forms of qualitative measurement give way to the quantitative. There's a kind of boom in the wonderful world of data processing technologies, and suddenly marketing is becoming increasingly understood as a science. That transition is like popularly understood both within marketing and market research as an industry, and it's also, I think, reproduced in how we do the periodization of it as scholars interested in this field. And a number of folks, some of them in this room, are pushing against that narrative construction. And what I've been interested in lately is looking at what actually happens to the qualitative, what happens to narrative in marketing in the 70s and in the early 80s. Where does it go? Because it doesn't disappear, it just gets leveraged in different ways. And one of the places this has taken me is the Values and Lifestyles Survey. So the Values and Lifestyle Survey, or more popularly known as VALS, was created by the Stanford Research Institute in the 1970s, and SRI has like its own wild history that we don't quite have time to get into today, but essentially, VALS was an attempt to break the entirety of the United States into 9 personality profiles, and then to ladder those personality profiles using Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So at the bottom, you'd have survivors, and at the top, you had integrated. And you could imagine these as essentially laddered from folks who are attempting to cover their most base material needs to folks who have ascended the kind of necessities that exist to flourish in the world and are arriving at a point in time where they have to figure out kinds of emotional and self-directed affirmations. VALS emerges in the 1980s during this transition from the idea of demographic marketing, which are still terms we use today, such as like white male teens aged 13 to 19, to forms of market segmentation that exist along psychological lines. The term in use now would be psychographic profiling, which is a portmanteau of psychology and demographics. VALS promised to do this at a new massive scale that hadn't been imagined before, thanks to the power of data processing technologies. And it became enormously popular to write about, but itself was quite expensive. And so the merchandisers or media companies that would pay for VALS would use it to figure out where their particular segments might exist in the world, and then to reposition all their advertising, all of their content to better speak to those particular personalities or types. But in reality, it was particularly expensive and not really accessible for a smaller business or a smaller firm. What makes VALS so interesting to me, though, is that it becomes a kind of signpost for this transition, this movement in marketing away from demographics. Now, this is interesting to me because at first it seems kind of silly. We live in a world where the language of marketing is totally in culture. We all think of demographic market segments, yet psychographics and appeals to scientific measurement and marketing really do begin to signpost in the 1980s this total transition away from the what one called slapdash, one marketing critic called slapdash interpretation that is involved with qualitative market study to grounded in science forms of data analysis that can reveal communities of consumers that cut across demographic difference. Whenever I see pieces like this, the James Atlas essay from The Atlantic, I'm immediately curious to learn more, because how often does the kind of knowledge that's produced inside of corporations or between corporations, market research, which is typically proprietary, actually break out into popular culture and become something that is written on and thought about, and what happens to these categories? VALS enters popular culture and kind of mass market consumption through a book which is published in 1982 called The 9 American Lifestyles: How Our Values, Beliefs, Drives, and Needs Will Combine with Social Trends to Shape Our Future. VALS is, or 9 American Lifestyles is a really odd and interesting book because it is introducing the VALS concept to the mass market, to a mass market readership, but it is doing it by couching the conclusions of VALS, these 9 personalities, in the language of Reisman's A Lonely Crowd and through Maslow's ideas about needs and satisfaction. And so it's part marketing, it's part management, but it's also part pop sociology or psychology, inviting readers to begin to understand themselves on the terms which this company's, what was originally called, I think, Futures Research Unit, ends up developing as a marketing platform. And so my interest in the book and in VALS actually came out of just like flipping through a used copy of it I found at BMV in Toronto, which surprised me because once you get to the kind of meat of the book, what you discover is it is actually full of qualitative narratives, portraits, or melodramas. So the book featured narrative composites that it called portraits, which taught readers who the normative consumer was for each of the 9 types. But as Kira Lucier, who's also in the chat box here today, or in the chat box, she's not in the chat box, you're on the list, Kira, hi. As Kira Lucier has argued elsewhere, and Kira and I talk about a lot, VALS actually developed its categories before it had done any research. And so it had determined essentially what it was looking for to slot the data they were going to find. The most surprising part of VALS is that the narratives they offer would have been familiar to anyone reading this book in 1984, or 1982 rather. The lowest rung, Miss Washington, was an African-American woman who had moved north to Boston, but because of a lack of access to economic resources, had given up. It was drawing on the same tropes that had defined the Moynihan Report, the cult of poverty thesis, and later would shape the welfare queen. So much so that the second half of Miss Washington's portrait is all about how her habits are being reproduced in her own son. And so the data that's being squared away against the set of personalities that are being built for VALS are essentially mirroring almost perfectly earlier tropes that are already in existence. And then as a popular press book, a book that's read by ordinary people, they're also inviting ordinary people to understand themselves through these. I'm currently working with a bunch of students at UTM to map out what happens to these categories. Where do Miss Washington or survivors generally, or the folks at the top of the hierarchy end up going? And you find it in some really surprising places. The National Geographic runs a mass market advertising campaign promoting their particular psychographic segments in the New York Times. A number of introduction to popular culture and cultural studies textbooks in the 1990s use VALS categories to teach the power of stereotype and then how to justify stereotypes against data. And so like literally doing the thing VALS isn't doing. And then even the United Farm Workers use VALS to begin to figure out how to selectively and strategically push for improved engagement with the great boycotts. In a bunch of different states in the United States, VALS is also used to essentially develop home layouts that are better appeal to specific markets. And so what is interesting to me about VALS, beyond the fact that it's like marketing as social criticism, and essentially like translating what, or claiming quantification when it's really running with human narrative, is that we get to see the actual tropes, these actual narratives move into spaces that we typically don't imagine as being part of market research. So information that's produced within the firm, moving out of the firm, and then becoming part of a larger shared language for how to classify, count, and imagine both Americans today, but what Americans will look in the future as well. So I think that was just about 7 minutes. Thank you.
Cool. I'll share my screen. How do I do it? Can people see it? Yes. Great. Yeah, I just got a notification about running a scheduled scan. So hopefully that my computer won't shut down, but maybe, let's see. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about algorithmic management tools, influencer management tools. Let's see if I can, here we are. So here is one of the tools as it looks. This is one of the, yeah, this is Maverick, one of the, basically how it's presented. So these tools are used by brands and marketing agencies at the moment to help them identify influencers to hire for advertorials. So we know that spend in influencer marketing has gone up during lockdown because these people are sort of experts in making content from home. The barriers to entry and the costs and overheads are quite low. So in 2019, about 40% of brands surveyed by Influencer Marketing Hub, which is like a trade press, they said that they use these they use third-party intermediary tools in their practice. And there's a lot of investment in them at the moment. There's a lot of attention to these kinds of tools. So the 10 largest influencer management tools earned $200 million net revenue in 2019, and they had 80% growth. So a lot of them have either too many vowels or not enough vowels. We've got like Tracker, Maverick, Upfluence. So it's not, you know, surprising what these things are called. So why are they being used? Like, why is all of this attention being put to them? Why are brands employing them? Brands are concerned about influencers that they hire for promotional work and for advertorials, having public scandals. So sometimes this is because they act in ways that's not consistent to their self-brand. So we have vegan vloggers who are caught eating fish in the background of someone else's vlog. We've got a lot of racism, a lot of public racist comments, a lot of unearthing of racist tweets. And we've got things like the Logan Paul controversy, which was in New Year's Eve, I think like 2 years ago now, but he was a very, very popular, well, still is, a very popular YouTuber who insensitively filmed a victim of suicide in his vlog. So there's concerns about the sort of moral implications of these events and the decrease in value of the influencers' brands. But there's also this material concern because after these scandals, generally these people lose subscribers, lose followers. So there's concerns about like a drop in eyeballs to content, basically. So there's this real demand to understand and predict and stop influencers like airing or to not hire an influencer who's going to have a scandal, basically. So Cédric Dordain, who is the Chief Digital Officer for L'Oreal, told The Drum, like a marketing press, he said, "We want to know more detail about the background of the influencers for what they've posted in the past, not just on Instagram, but on any social platform and any website or blog or forum. We need to spend more time looking into individuals to make sure we don't have any brand safety issues like nude pictures." So there's this real demand for surveillance, like looking backwards as a form of control. And it's interesting that L'Oreal are so concerned about this like promiscuity or sexual connotations of nude pictures. Similarly, Unilever's former chief marketing officer, Keith Weed, made a big statement at Cannes. He was really like drilling down on this. It was covered really widely, that he said that there was urgent action needed to tackle influencer fraud. So that means like fake followers, paid for followers, bots, that kind of thing. So what are the tools? What do they do, more likely? So they offer influencer search. So they allow brands to find influencers. They algorithmically calculate things like safety and risk. They predict return on investment for campaigns. So there's this idea that they'll be able to tell you how much you're going to get back for what you spend. They offer demographics data and audience interests. They offer you the ability to monitor a campaign. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about each of these things, hopefully not too fast. So search. This is one tool called PEG. This screen grab is from, it's a UK-based influencer management tool. So it makes it easy to search and find influencers in distinct categories in saturated markets. So I would caution this statistic, but estimates put the number of YouTube channels with 1 million plus subscribers at 16,000. It's really difficult to find verifiable stats with this kind of stuff, but it's around there. And suffice to say, it's a very, very saturated market. There's a lot of people making content, and advertisers work with influencers who have upwards of 10,000 followers. So there's a lot of people in this market. So when you search, this gives advertisers the ability to flatten content and production along the lines of commercially friendly and recognizable genres. So for example, cosmetics and makeup vlogging. So if you exist outside of these commercially friendly, or if you're making content that's slightly less easily understandable or outside of a fixed genre, then it's very difficult for you to be able to be found using these tools. So the other thing they do is predict return on investment. So this is one of my favorites. This is a tool called The Eye, which was produced by Style Hall, which is now defunct because one of their leaders embezzled a lot of money and invested it in cryptocurrency, and they had to shut down. But this tool, they released a white paper about it, which is really shocking actually when you read some of the stuff in the white paper, by 3 professors from Berkeley, Cambridge and Chicago. So it gave creators a different score based on their age, gender, ethnicity, their friendships with other influencers, so like clout, audience demographics and affinity with brand topics. And so, I mean, it's really problematic, obviously, how this could be used. Like, it gives you the ability to find influencers based on their race. And then also it algorithmically approximates things like the success of different face shapes. So they'd be like, heart-shaped faces are better for particular cosmetics campaigns, which is obviously really raised. And yeah, I just could talk about this for a long time, but it's very problematic. Then the other thing that they do is provide this demographics data. So there's no trust really with influencers providing their own follower numbers and their own like demographics breakdown. So brands don't trust that. So there's no centralized rating service, and like everyone only has access to their own YouTube analytics, for example. So tools claim to provide verifiable demographics, but these demographics are approximated based on publicly available data. So tools only have access to the same APIs that we have access to with social media platforms. So influencers like become really alienated from this data. Like, they don't know how it's being figured out, or they don't know how they're being presented in tools, whether it's right. And some tools do give you the ability to verify with them, so sign up and give them access to your APIs. But obviously doing that for 20 different tools, and that is very time consuming, and many influencers like don't know that they exist, I think. There's also a lot of subjective assessments of risk and safety. So this is PEG again. So you'll get a numeric score, which will calculate how brand safe you are. So we can see Tyler Oakley here. He's a very famous YouTuber. I would argue one of the most brand safe influencers. He like works with a lot of brands like Head and Shoulders, but he's gay. He talks a lot about LGBTQ issues. So he's used the word queer. We can see, you might not be able to see because it's quite small, but basically this tool has used natural language processing to identify the use of different profanity, so swear words. And they've identified that he's used the word queer 39 times, which has diminished his family-friendly score. Sorry, there's a lot going on here, and I know I'm going through it really fast. But basically, what I want to say is these tools like smooth again and flatten all of these really complex and slightly problematic, again, categorizations that build and calcify bias within these scores. So Tyler Oakley, who is very brand friendly, has a score of 4, whereas we can see that PewDiePie has, who is very publicly sort of had a lot of scandals around uttering racist words or using or just like racist content, only has a family friendly score of just 1 less. So we can see these categorizations are really, really uneven and very unfair. So the key aims and questions for this project, basically. So I want to map the role of new intermediaries who are designed to stabilize influencer marketing industries. A lot of this industry is positioned as the Wild West, like as problematic again as that is. That's how it's often positioned, and these tools are one intermediary that's basically being marketed as being able to stabilize and rationalize those industries. I'm really interested in the role of brand safety and what that means, because no one can say what it means, even though it's frequently discussed and frequently talked about. And so I'd love a historical, I just really want to know what brand safety means. And if anyone does know, then that would be great. But yeah, how are this conceptualized by human intermediaries, and how by algorithms, and sort of how do those work in tandem? And then how do tools contribute and amplify existing inequalities in content creation and influencer industries? And that's it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Fantastic. We already have a question from Michelle in the chat, but perhaps we can start with if there's a way to make some connections between the 3 presentations. Jennifer, how long do we have today?
Officially, we end at 2, and people are welcome to stay or leave. I'm going to leave the Zoom open and stay here so the conversation can continue.
Okay.
Yeah.
All of you mark important thresholds in terms of change in marketing as industry, and I'm wondering, starting with Devon's presentation, thinking about the temporal and future as not a far future or a sustained future, but a next. And I'm wondering if there's also a shakedown in terms of the economy of some of these industries. Because, I mean, if we go all the way to Sophie, you know, we have shakiness in terms of how are we accounting for this data? Some of this just seems like, you know, design fiction. But beyond Logan Paul being a dick, can I say that? Do we have a future? Do we have a future here in terms of a projected stability? And I guess I would try to bring Dan's question and kind of the periods that he's looking at with Val's in terms of the if I'm understanding you correctly, the kind of obfuscation of narrative and human narrative in relationship to the data-driven. So that was a big bundle of mushiness. I hope there was something there that you guys can hold on to.
I was going to suggest that Sophie or Dan go first, because I feel like my answer will take us in a different direction.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this has been really interesting, this project, because like I've been studying influence economies for, I guess, 5 years now. And even in that short time, they've changed and developed so much. So there was always kind of a disagreement about how to rationalize and how to make this content sort of fit this identifiable commercial genres and commercial narratives, because I would say all the marketing stakeholders who work around this industry aren't new. They've been in this industries for a long time, and I think also the brands often have a very cautious and very, like, I would say, normative sort of approach to working with them. So I think it's really interesting how these attempts to stabilize the industry have like changed. There was more talent management. Now there's talk about automation and AI. So I think like as this industry develops, there's just going to be like, I don't know, this is a project that I guess is still very much being grappled with. And it's also very decentralized. So it's difficult to kind of pinpoint it. It's very slippery. That's what I would say.
Devon, do you want to, or shall I?
Yeah, you should go.
Okay, cool. The thing that has struck me most about trying to follow trend forecasting and these kinds of projections from like 82 onwards is how much is produced and how few of them actually take off. So VALS becomes incredibly popular, but it immediately, like in 8 years, it falls away, and there's a VALS 2 by 1992. And you can watch as the ad agencies begin to try to develop their own internal marketing models that can do this kinds of projection. And I mean, if we go to 2019, even a year ago, just because I taught Devon's book and my students were somehow aware of this, and it shocked me. Wunderman Thompson's Future 100 for 2019. It is like a hilarious read now. It's exhausting. It's a hilarious read because, like, you know, they were right. Cozy came back, but not how they thought. And so the kinds of modeling expectation, the kind of expectation, the kinds of materials produced, the next is like the right answer, I think, and a lot of power in that word, because the next is like profoundly contingent, even if it feels immediate.
Yeah, and my answer sort of dovetails really nicely with that, which is that so in my research, I was really interested in the way that sort of futurism came into marketing, and was specifically looking at how like futurism and futurist methods and futurology influenced marketing thinking from the 70s forward. And so I actually think when people are talking about the future, they're often talking about at least 2, if not like 4 different things, right? Sometimes they're talking about using methods, both quantitative and qualitative, to strategically predict an outcome that you can then shape and measure. And sometimes they're just talking about it as a form of inspiration, or almost like a rhetoric that like will get people to, you know, maybe change their branding profile a little bit, right? So like depending, and a number of different range of things in between. And so what I found is both people, this sort of idea of nextness, and that there's a real comfort level in being able to talk about like, oh, here's what's hip, and almost for no purpose, right? Like these Wunderman Thompson reports almost serve like, I don't want to say they serve no strategic purpose at all, but very few companies are actually making their plans based on these. They're fully inspirational in terms of how they operate these reports. But then there is the kind of sort of like nitty gritty nuts and bolts. Some of it is quantitative, some of it is qualitative work that's done. And a lot of that is rooted in very contemporary assumptions as well, despite the fact that it pretends not to be. So that's sort of like a complicated answer, but the bottom line of it is that the idea of the future serves rhetorical as well as strategic purposes, and when the language of the future gets mobilized, it gets mobilized to mean all sorts of different things depending on who's talking.
Right, and why tie-dye? Is that a kind of sentimental reverie, like, oh, remember the 60s, things were more disruptive but better, and I don't know?
I have a lot to say about tie-dye, but I'll just say a general thing about fashion. And fashion is almost the most interesting place to watch this stuff unfurl, because even fast fashion has a relatively long lead time, right? So like you'll watch with fabric, material, or color forecasts, or even cuts and silhouettes and things. The most interesting thing for me has been to watch this year unfurl in the way that people imagined fashion would unfurl, as opposed to the way that it did, right? And in the US anyway, there's not a good example of that happening other than the Gulf War, which people talk about sort of in lore as like in 1991, they imagined people would want to wear pink, and then the Gulf War happened and everybody wanted to wear khaki and camouflage, right? So like, which is sort of like a silly example, but I guess what I'm saying is that because of the lead time of fashion, sort of the ideas of what would be popular don't correspond very well to what's actually happening on the ground, and you sort of get a disconnect, which is why you saw so many companies scrambling to make masks, to make sweatpants and joggers and all of these different kinds of things after people were staying home, or to re-edit their fashion pages so that, like, you know, what I'm wearing now is somehow a work from home top, right? When it was just a top before. Also, my cat just bit me, so I'm sorry that she's like, you're not paying attention to me, so I gotta get rid of her.
I'd like to ask you guys about the September issue, because there had to be some forethought in terms of the placing black models, dark skinned black models with natural hair, kind of, or some of them as the kind of the bulk of it, because it wasn't just the content, it was also in the advertising. But it's important that everybody piles in here. So I will just ask you that question another day. Do you want to look at Michelle's question, Devon? And Natalie is thanking us. And does anybody else want to ask a question now, because the clock is running down? Okay, Kira has a question.
Hi, thanks so much for your talks. I realize we're at the end of time, so but if people are still here, I guess I'll just ask it. So one thing I'm fascinated, I have kind of a two-part question. One is thinking about, and this kind of stems from kind of some of Dan's comments, but I think it really addresses all three papers, is thinking of the kind of methods of thinking about the future, because, you know, as Dan pointed out, I think we hear all this, you know, there's this like data analytics, and it's that kind of like big data, sexy big data, but really I think all of your presentations are showing the kind of deeply, like, you know, not just that of course there are like ideologies and assumptions based in, but also they're doing these very kind of qualitative analysis of like how you assess what the safety, you know, safety score is, or like, you know, these kind of like narrative scenarios for imagining the future, even though so much of the kind of buzzy rhetoric is around this like analytics, like, oh, we can have all this data and that's how we actually analyze it. So I'm kind of interested in that tension. And then briefly, I'm just, if you don't have time to comment, that's fine, but I'm kind of also interested in the parallel with the other place I see a lot of the business side of future is the future of work. Like all I hear is kind of the future of work. And I think in similar ways, it's like they're saying, oh, the future of work will be remote as a way to kind of justify, say, current decisions about like slashing office space. And so that same kind of interplay is I see at work. So comments on any of those points would be great.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I can say something about methods, and maybe I can do this and weave into the question that was in the chat as well, which is basically like, yes, right? Like, I think if there's nothing that the pandemic, like if the pandemic has taught us one lesson about methods, it's that like quantitative methods have a lot of messy qualitative data behind them, and then you put a number on it and suddenly everybody thinks it's a real thing that we have to sort of abide by and follow, right? And the same thing holds true across all of these futurist spaces as well, and these predictive analytics, I think. One of the things I didn't get to talk about, but I had a picture of on my slide, is one of the companies that I study is in the process of building an AI that can do this kind of cultural trend forecasting. And when you hear them talk about it, if you don't listen too closely, it's like watching an episode of ER, and if you don't listen too closely, it sounds very scientific, and then you're like, wait a second, what did you just say? You just said like it can do what, right? But it's basically, they've basically taken all of their qualitative methods and tried to figure out a way to sort of to automate them, which works, and as long as there's a human to sort of interpret the results when they come out. So again, I don't know if that's more really an answer to your question, but sort of gets at this idea of like, yeah, it's always very messy, but there's a lot of hype around artificial intelligence right now, and these companies feel like they have to have an AI or say that they're building one because it's a marketing tool, and how well it works is almost beside the point. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah, just to briefly jump in on that, I think that's just absolutely right. Like when, like they even, I think one of the tools that I look at, even Marcus itself, is like, we're experts in the sciencey stuff, like don't worry about it. But
right.
then one of the things that they do is assess press coverage around certain influences but all they're doing is like counting words and doing just like, you know, very rudimentary kind of content analysis and natural language processing. And one of my favorite errors that happens in the tools is if someone dies with the same name as one of the influencers, the obituary is always categorized as very negative press coverage. So and that's like not been caught. So I just think there's so many things that really need human translation and just don't translate. And just don't work essentially.
Dan, did you want to jump onto that?
Sure. There is a category of person that I'm interested in that it begins to bubble up in the 80s, which is the marketing consultant as futurist, as futurologist. There's their earlier iterations too. Philip Kotler writes a lot about this is studying marketing in the 70s. But it is curious to me that the futurist as a kind of person seems to become more and more almost obfuscated as influencers become kind of the dominant way that we begin thinking about how trends are leveraged. Because you don't really see people who have command over this the way that the marketing folks I'm looking at in the 80s and 90s will claim that they have an intimate understanding of the gay market or Latino market or the women's market, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is, like, my students call it the influencer bubble, and they're waiting for it to pop. Which I think is really interesting, because when it pops, there's a sort of, at least in the context of the current industry, the assumption that it will be replaced by kinds of measurements that will be outside of our control.
Christine had a question.
Hi, thanks for your great talks. And while I'm having your expertise, your diverse areas of expertise here, I'd love to field a question that might seem left field, but I was wondering if all of you could comment on perhaps the ascent of astrology apps and astrologiization memes that maybe just in I empirically felt picked up during COVID or even just the past few years. Because if we're talking about this kind of this return to pre-industrial mechanisms of futurism, and I'm not just thinking of astrology apps like CoStar and Sanctuary that allegedly draw on a combination of AI writing and NASA data to like provide you algorithmically determined personalized projections, but I'm also thinking of the popularization of astrology categorization memes to relate to Dan's work when you talked about those 9 discrete lifestyles. I think a lot about the mass sharing of memes of like, oh, aligning your star sign. I'm a Leo, so my lifestyle is aligned to a Starbucks coffee or a gemstone of the day. And I'm wondering, this seems, again, a little left field, but I was really curious if you could draw on your various, like how that new digitized turn of looking to the stars at all impacts your work.
I'm going to jump in because I love this question and I have a lot to say about it. So there's a few ways I think I would answer it. And the caveat here, my preface will be that the forms of future and trend forecasting that I studied, I think that there's something to it, right? I think that we can sort of like poke fun at it and we can think it's funny and think it's ridiculous. And some of it definitely is, but there's also something to it insofar as you take extremely observant people and you give them free reign over culture, and that's all they do all day is read and talk to people and look at focus groups and look at marketing and whatnot. Do social media listening, whatever. And then, you know, you take that knowledge and they actually do have pretty good understanding of culture, you know, a limited and, you know, easily problematized version of culture, but they do sort of understand stuff. So I say that to say that like astrology has been a trend for the last few years. In fact, when I was giving this book talk last year, I would talk about astrology at the beginning of it. And there's a lot of explanations that forecasters would give about why astrology is ascendant in terms of like a return to nostalgia, and it's connected to like the rise of tea and like people smoking cannabis and, you know, all of these sorts of different things. And I could say a lot more too about the methods that connect these two things together, but I'll put that on the table. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing that I would say is that I think the future is a trend. I think that futurism is hot across like all different terrains, and people are very interested in questions about the future, in part because of these some of these big sort of scary climate change, systemic racism, this sort of collapse of society stuff, which the pandemic has only accentuated. So I think that that's part of it too. And then I think that like this marriage between like the mystical or the natural and data is happening across a bunch of different paradigms as well. You're seeing with life hacking, body hacking. You're seeing it with like, you know, skin creams that are supposedly tailored to your DNA. You're seeing it with ancestry.com and things like that. So there are all of these ways in which people are trying to find, trying to take some of that turn towards the holistic and data and digitize it, or the turn towards the mystical. And I think astrology is also part of that. And I'll say companies use astrology, right? So there are corporate consultants who also use astrology to help corporations make decisions, which I'm looking at Kira now because I know that's not exactly what she studies, but it just says that there's like all of these different sort of forms of knowledge that corporations grasp at to just kind of suck in and be like, okay, maybe this is the thing that'll help us figure out. Maybe it's psychological tests, maybe it's astrology, maybe it's, you know, birth order. It's all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, and Dan just put a helpful comment in the chat as well. Do people have capacity for one more question? Michelle wrote a really rich one. I'll read it. This is a question I want to put here. I'm looking at Korean media fan culture online in my work, and there's been such a flurry of discussions of how to account for the transnational fan media communities on Anglophone platforms, or how to conceive of who's being marketed to, where, and how, when we're talking about influencer culture, not to mention the participation of global fan communities in online activism around BLM. In the arenas that the presenters are looking at, is there an explicit examination of the default North American perspective, or the projection of a certain consumer subjectivity as a global one? For example, clearly futurist ideas spread around the world, especially in the context of the Cold War against socialist futurism, for example. That's a great question. Can we do that in 3 minutes?
I would just say very briefly that the marketing industries that I look at, and influencer marketing industries, are very short-sighted and very normative. When thinking about the ideal consumer, there's lots of ways that they miss and wouldn't draw from, like, for example, other platforms, from creators and fan communities that are speaking languages other than English. And I think that, yeah, this is a super important point. I'll just be very brief in that way, but I think, yeah, like it's extremely short-sighted actually, and doesn't take that into account.
I would say, at least in the 80s and 90s, there's with the ascent of what was then called multicultural marketing, where that is considered a site of like on scale, like enormous value. It is posed as a risk to general market campaigns, which are always imagined around a normative, cis white North American audience. And so it puts a severe limit on how even marketers who come from other places or might want to bring to market their own community, it puts a severe limit on what they can do when they are expressing their community or their background as their particular expertise. And so it's a kind of, marketing is a great place to look if you want to understand the fundamental limits of inclusion in a market society.
Yeah. I think also, just to like tie this up with your point that you said earlier, Dan, like I think if you're thinking about influencers as people who are experts because they kind of live the identities that they have, so like influencers, rather than being sort of outside of the communities that they're experts in, like supposedly they're able to reach them because they have an authentic connection with them. And I think that in a lot of ways, influencers who aren't white, like mostly Black influencers, like aren't recognized as experts, like in speaking to the communities that they like understand and address, and are often they're often underpaid, and sort of they're not basically, yeah, their expertise isn't taken seriously in that way, which I think is also important.
Yeah, and I would say in my work, it's basically a colonial relationship where you see that what matters in terms of being determined as a future or as a trend are the things that people are doing in the centers of, in the sort of like global north centers of metropolitan centers, basically. So like the kind of stuff that gets sucked up and is marketable to those people is what is what is seen as mattering. And that's the interest, the sort of this kind of like, you know, very colonial interest in particular in different countries, and an understanding of transnationalism, but only through its utility to the global elite.
It's 2:14. I've got to go in 1 minute, but I don't want to shut this down. So is there, David's got a question. David, shoot.
Thanks. Thanks. Good to see you all. I have a question sort of about trust and fraud. I've been studying the digital advertising ecosystem. And one of the things that struck me after a really long time studying it, that there is so much fraud, right? Joseph Thoreau wrote about this fraud and waste and such. And I'm wondering how that plays out in each of your industries as they mature, right? So Facebook has been known, there's a lot of fraud in video clips and clicking and all of that. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that, and also then new auditors emerge, right? Like Nielsen way back, and all these sort of companies that say, okay, there is fraud or some fuzziness, but then we have new external intermediaries that check. So is that even possible? Like with influencer marketing, would you have external new companies that check the, you know, can you fact check or have accountability in trend forecasting? So that's my question.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, so this, like, basically, I think that there's a real lack of trust in influencers and the content that they produce. I think they start from a default position, like an assumption that they're somehow fraudulent, unless they have real tangible connections to marketers, which they often have if they're privileged and they have these existing networks anyway. So yeah, so there's this, I think these tools are basically introduced to introduce this layer of trust, but the problem is there's no network effects for these tools. There's so many of them and they work in such disparate ways, and none of them are like a centralized system like Nielsen. There's no, like, the tools themselves, I guess, are not trusted. They're still pitching for business to different brands and different different agencies, and probably agencies will employ more than one. So I think that like, I don't really know what will happen. All I know is there is this flurry of investment in these tools. So whether the sort of winner takes all effects like happens and one of them just does turn into the industry watchdog would be interesting to understand.
I don't know, Dan, if you had anything to say about fraud, but I'll just say it's a, you know, there's a lot of discussion about accuracy within the realm of cultural trend forecasting that I study. But most of this, it sort of circulates around reputation, right? So there's certain forecasters who will be like, we're 95% accurate, or we have a track record of X, which is never measured and never assessed, and there's no like certification for it. You can just sort of say it to kind of brand yourself. But you know, I think that I mean, it's interesting going back to what Dan said about that Wunderman Thompson report. So just in case people are unfamiliar, Wunderman Thompson is an advertising agency. It was formerly known as JWT or J. Walter Thompson. They're now Wunderman Thompson. They have a sort of sub agency within them that is a futures trend forecasting agency. They have a couple of AI tools, and they produce regular reports as well as an annual report. And actually, because their 2020 forecast was so bad, they had to do another one in March. And then I was like, no, here, we got all this stuff wrong. Here's the real one. But like that kind of stuff almost doesn't, there's a weird way in which it doesn't matter, because like I said, people are not using it, despite the fact that they're using it to get ideas and inspiration. They're almost using it to justify things that they already wanted to do often. Yeah. So that sense of accountability is just kind of not there. And the fact that everybody missed the pandemic damaged absolutely none of their businesses. In fact, it amplified their businesses, as far as everything I've been able to tell from the context that I have. And I interviewed about 70 forecasters from around the world, and most of them are working more now, not less.
Mm.
with vowels, it becomes a cultural touchstone, and people are reading about it, people are talking about it. Unions are using it, right? They managed to make a ton of money for Time magazine, and that's what they're turning on constantly. They reference Time and their success with Time a bunch in the early 80s. But at the same time that vowels is blowing up, JWT, what is now Wunderman Thompson, they had a research center throughout much of the 60s through, I think, right up to the early 90s, where they hired folks to just read both academic literature, but also trade press literature and summarize it. And it was in Chicago, and it would be distributed out to the various units around the world. They mostly panned vowels. They didn't think it was possible to do this kind of massive cluster analysis at the level of a nation. But even so, like you have new kinds of, or claims to new kinds of technology emerging that are only going to make it ever more accurate. And so long as you can claim it's more, vowels 2 is more precise than vowels 1, it's fine. Even if the companies attempting to test it are finding that most folks fall between like 5 different personalities, or as was the case with vowels 1, despite having 9 personalities, nobody actually fits the integrated one, the top level personality. They can't find anybody, and 46% of Americans, 45% of Americans had fallen into external directed just above survivor. And so everyone's still aggregated. It's a fantasy of more precision. And it feels like a kind of fraud when you start to realize the math doesn't even really work out. But it is interesting to watch as the agencies, the major agencies that are holding groups or other agencies are like, this isn't that useful. It begins to explode in culture as a way for us to read and encounter ourselves, and begins being taught as a way to understand the different kinds of communities that exist in the world.
Mm.
It's not good. That's how I end that paper.
Do we have any final questions? We could take one more if someone has one, or we can break here. Okay. Well, thank you all for such a wonderful discussion today. Thank you, Devon, Sophie, Dan, and unfortunately Beth had to leave, but it was wonderful to be involved with everyone. Thank you to everyone who came, and especially to the people who posed such really provocative questions.